Hey guys, Jeremy here with KISS Aquatic Systems. KISS, keep it simple, stupid. So today we are going to talk about houseplants, and in particular, how much houseplants really love dirty fish tank water. These are my houseplants, and as you can see, I really do have way too many. To the point where it's a little bit weird and embarrassing. In all fairness, though, it's not entirely my fault. So I've been keeping houseplants for about 3 years, and of everything you see here today, probably 75–80% of it is really just organic growth. And I believe the number one driver of that growth is the fact that I use fish tank water for these plants rather than just normal tap water. So in this video, first I'm going to go through in great detail how I set up and take care of these plants to show clearly that it is the fish tank water that is driving the growth here. And then I will talk about why fish tank water is so much better for plants than normal tap water. So let's start with the substrate. I do not use normal or organic potting soil for these plants. The reason being is that I started off using normal organic potting soil and I had a huge problem with fungus gnats, which, as I understand, is actually a fairly common problem with houseplants. So, normal dirt or potting soil is extremely rich in all different kinds of nutrients. Way more nutrients than your plants can use in any reasonable amount of time. And I, as many people do, tend to overwater my plants, or at least I used to. So the combination of very high nutrients and moist environment led to fungus growth, and with the fungus growth, I also had a thriving colony of fungus gnats, which was really annoying. So very early on, I decided to get rid of all my potting soil and instead build my own soilless potting mix that is very low in nutrients. So the base of my potting mix is probably about 80% peat moss and 20% play sand. Peat moss is a very common and cheap and popular soil alternative. So what it is, it's decomposed sphagnum moss that's been sitting on the bottom of a peat bog for a few hundred years. It's mined, it's dried out, it's baked, and then it's sold at garden centers at a pretty reasonable price. And I use the play sand to add heft and weight to my soilless potting mix. Truth is, peat moss is a bit light and I don't want my plants ever to tip over. People also use sand in their soilless potting mixes to create additional drainage for water. Play sand is not all that great for that, to be honest. It's a very fine grain, easily compacting sand, so it doesn't allow a whole lot of drainage. A better drainage sand would probably be a larger grain sand, like a pool filter sand. But play sand works okay, as you can see with my plants. I also have a generous amount of perlite in my soilless potting mix and garden lime. So many people use perlite or vermiculite in their potting mixes to help retain water. Sounds a bit weird, but when you're building a plant mix, you want to be able to both drain water easily and retain water. So you want to drain water because you don't want your roots to become waterlogged and create problems like root rot or fungus gnats. And you want to retain enough water for your plant to be able to draw from between waterings. Perlite and vermiculite are both great for holding on to water between waterings. Vermiculite is generally a bit better, but I use perlite. It works just fine for most plants. Obviously, if you have a bog plant or a water-loving plant, you might want to do things a bit differently. And lastly, I use garden lime to buffer up my mix and bring up my pH. So peat moss is a great alternative to dirt, but it has a very low pH, usually in the mid fours. And the water I'm using for my plants is also soft and acidic. And the truth is, many people's plant substrates do acidify over time. So it is helpful from time to time to add something like garden lime into your plant substrate to help buffer it up and bring your pH to a reasonable level, call it mid sixes, where most plants will do well. So that's all on the substrate. Very, very low in nutrients. The only nutrients that I'm providing through my substrate are whatever is in the peat moss, which provides some but not a significant amount of help for my plants. I really do rely on my fish tank water to provide the vast majority of my nutrients. Moving on to lighting, as you can see here, I have these plants facing a relatively large south-ish facing window. It's probably more of a southeast facing window. Now, I get pretty decent sunlight most times of year. I'm in the woods, so not a ton of sun, but enough for these plants to generate decent photosynthesis. I also supplement the natural lighting with a fixture, as you can see, where I am currently running 6500K CFL bulbs. Not a huge fan of these bulbs, to be honest. I think I'm actually going to swap them out pretty soon with some nice 6500K LEDs. So the CFL bulbs tend to run a bit hotter than LEDs, and from time to time, they do release a faint odor of burning plastic or burning chemicals that I am not a fan of. So I don't often sniff my light bulbs, but I generally do want them to be odorless. And I think the fact that the LEDs run a bit cooler puts less pressure on the plastic in this cheap and simple light fixture. By the way, 6500K is a great spectrum for photosynthesis and plant growth. Also happens to be the same way I light my reef tank for my corals. So moving on from lighting, the humidity in this room usually runs somewhere between 30 to 40%, which is fairly dry and on the dry end for plants, but they have learned to cope and adapt. Most houseplants are tropicals, and most plants in general like conditions to be a bit more humid. It helps prevent the leaves from drying out. But many plants, given time, can adapt to the somewhat drier conditions that are better in general for indoor environments. Because as we all know, if your house or apartment is too humid for too long, it can create mold and other issues. So helpful to get your houseplants to acclimate to the drier conditions that are better for humans. So as you can see overall, the conditions I have my plants in are not great by themselves for growth. I use a very, very low nutrient, soilless potting mix. I provide adequate but modest levels of lighting and a suboptimal dry environment for these plants. The reason they do so well is because of the fish tank water that I use. So the only work that I do with these plants is every 2 weeks, I will take exactly 4 gallons of water from one of my fish tanks. Particularly, I use the 40-gallon Hillstream tank because it's not heavily planted. And I use that to water my plants. Provides all of the water they need and almost all of the nutrients that they need. So, why do houseplants love fish tank water? Three main reasons for this. Number one is the fact that unlike your city tap water that you are most probably using instead of fish tank water does not have any chlorine or chloramines in it. Now, chlorine and chloramines are poisons. They are toxic to almost all forms of life, which is why we load them up in our swimming pools and why we also add them to our tap water in levels that are not particularly harmful to us humans, but are likely to kill any sorts of bacteria or other things that could otherwise live in our tap water and cause some serious health problems. So it's a good thing to have chlorine in our source tap water for us, but not so good for our plants. And it's really terrible for all the bacteria and microorganisms that are symbiotic with our plants that live in our substrates with our plant roots. So the simple fact that fish tank water does not, or really should not, contain any chlorine or chloramines makes it vastly superior to ordinary tap water when it comes to watering plants. Now, some of the hardier houseplants can handle some of the chlorine that we have in our tap water, but they would do much better without it. And a lot of the more fragile, sensitive, advanced houseplants, like orchids and things like that, will really not do well in general with chlorinated tap water. The second big benefit with using aquarium water versus tap water for houseplants is all the nutrients that you can provide with the aquarium water. So, what are aquariums? By definition, aquariums are tiny boxes of water that are dramatically and gratuitously overstocked with interesting life forms that we enjoy seeing. And as you might guess, the water in aquariums is often brimming with all kinds of nutrients. So, unless you're talking about a heavily planted tank, which is a bit lower in nutrients, most fish tank water has significant amounts of really every kind of nutrient that your houseplant will need to survive and thrive. Now, these nutrients will be available both in readily accessible ionic forms, as well as entrapped in the particulate and dissolved organic carbon that will slowly break down over time in your substrate and feed your plants. Fish tank water is often rich in macronutrients like nitrates and phosphates, and usually has a fair amount of easily accessible trace elements and ions in terms of iron, magnesium, calcium. Really anything your plants need is available to some extent in fish tank water. Now, the third benefit of using fish tank water for your plants isn't just the fact that it provides every nutrient that your plant needs, but also the way those nutrients are added. So, ideally, what you want to happen is every 2 weeks, as you water your houseplants, you provide a certain stream of nutrients. You want your plants to be uptaking those nutrients at a similar rate at which it's added. As I learned the hard way with my original heavy organic potting mix disaster, too much of a good thing is a bad thing. So if you're adding a lot of excess nutrients that your plants aren't able to use quickly, well, life is adaptable and it finds a way, and usually something else will pop up that will use those nutrients. And sometimes the things that pop up, like fungus or fungus gnats, are not things you want in your system. So the slow and steady release of nutrients that you get by using fish tank water versus a really, really heavily fertilized soil up front or dumping tons of fertilizer on your plants from time to time is a much better, safer way to add nutrients to your houseplants. So, taken together, as you can see, houseplants and plants in general really love and benefit from fish tank water. So if you are looking to get rampant growth from your houseplants, get a fish tank and use some of the water every week or so, or every 2 weeks, to water your plants. Before long, you will find yourself the proud owner of a lush and thriving jungle. So yeah, thanks guys. That's all on houseplants for now. Take care and hope you enjoyed the video.